Syrian civil war began in 2011 with the hope of a democratic Syria. 8 years down the line, I think we can all agree that that hope is nothing more than a dream, and the continuation of efforts to make democratic, like a post-Assad democratic Syria, will likely lead to nothing more than more bloodshed and a divided country and more instability in the future. A couple of things from open government. First, on the context and framing around the likely efficacy of American soldiers and the weighing you have to do on that front. Secondly, the possibility of escalation and the likelihood of it happening. Thirdly, Kurds post-conflict society. Finally, ISIS. First, on the conflict and framing of actually, what would we do as the model? We will withdraw the American ground presence in Syria. We will do things like limit American airstrikes, get rid of American military assistance and rebel groups fighting against Assad or others within Syria. So, on the context and framing. Note that American military presence in Syria is unlikely to be able to make a positive influence in Syria in the short or long term. A couple of reasons why. First, note that Assad has essentially won the war. Note the massive amount of territory he holds, both the major industrial heartlands and the vast majority of rural territory, means that the ability of democratic rebels, even if they exist, to launch offensives to regain territory in important cities that are necessary for negotiations with the post-conflict settlements is extremely unlikely. He controls most cities, Aleppo, Damascus, Homs. I wager the opposition to name a city that the non-Kurdish democratic rebels hold. If they can do that, and they weigh it up against the number of cities or territory Assad holds, we'll give them a bit of credit on this point. They're not going to be able to do so. Secondly, note that Assad has a massive amount of foreign support, and the degree of foreign support that Russia and Iran are willing to provide is significantly outweighs the amount of support the Americans are likely to give. Here's why. Note that Iran and Russia have direct strategic interests that are critical to their national or long-term security, as opposed to America, which has more ideological or like tangential concerns about terrorism. First, note that Iran believes that it needs to do things like ensure domestic tranquility among Shia, will have things like a land bridge to Lebanon, giving weapons and money to Hezbollah. It means that Iran's influence in Syria is more likely to be direct, and its incentive to stay there is just as strong. Russia wants warm water ports, which it's able to get from the Assad regime, which means that it will continue to support the Assad regime till the very end. Note the weighing you have to do against this is that the American military presence in Syria right now is relatively limited. There's 2,000 ground troops. We do a couple airstrikes every couple days, meaning that the likelihood that American military presence is going to be the tipping point in fighting back against the Russian and Iranian influence that Assad has is rather limited. Finally, note that the Kurds, which like the American military presence in Syria is most based on, have limited operational capacity. That is to say that they can only go in areas that are currently or historically held by Kurds and have massive amounts of Kurdish people. The capacity to expand beyond those areas and bring about American troops or like the territorial necessary for negotiations in Arab areas or non-Arab areas is significantly limited because of the Kurds. What exactly does this mean? Given the massive likelihood that Assad is already going to win the civil war, and even if he doesn't win outright, the possibility and the likelihood of his victory as a result of massive foreign support means that American military presence as it currently stands is unlikely to be effective unless OP advocates for massive escalation. In the absence of escalation from OP, the only thing they're advocating for is prolonging a conflict with an already inevitable outcome. The obvious harm of this is massive escalation brings about models of things like Iraq, in which U.S. ground troops have to be sent in direct combat roles, occupying significant amounts of territory because other groups are often unable to do so for the many reasons I prescribe. But let's give them their absolute best case, that the amount of American presence right now is sufficient enough to ensure a post-conflict settlement where Assad leaves power, the absolute best case for opposition bench. Why does this still lead to bad outcomes in Syria? A couple of reasons. First, note that the democratic opposition in Syria hardly exists anymore in the same form that it did in 2011. A significant amount of splintering has existed amongst the opposition, mainly because Assad's strategy specifically has been to divide the rebels amongst different territories. So you circle one city, so the rebels in that city can't communicate with other cities. What this means is that rebel groups are formed with a wide variety of different incentives. In addition to the fact that when you regionally separate rebel groups, as Assad has done, ethnic and religious and linguistic tensions between rebel groups are most prominent. This is why, for instance, the umbrella group known as the Free Syrian Army no longer exists in Syria the same way that it did previously, and it's only a bunch of smaller ethnic and religious segmented groups. In addition, recognize that the harsh realities of wars have meant that limited resources and violence means that people naturally fall upon primordial links such as ethnicity and religion. So the best case on OP is one in which Assad leaves power because of American military presence, but it still means that the power vacuum that comes afterwards is likely to mean significantly more instability than ever. So, why exactly does this lead to more escalation? The second part of the speech. Note that the possibility of direct harm upon American soldiers is significantly high because of the fact that they're very often within the center of conflict and are often advising Kurdish troops embedded within those very troops. For instance, a couple of days ago, American soldiers and Russian mercenaries were involved in firefights. What are the harms of this? First, note that individual commanders on the ground have an incentive to retaliate because they don't want to lose strategic means, meaning that the possibility of tit-for-tat escalation increases. But secondly, note that the political pressure that exists on presidents and Congress, regardless of if it's someone crazy like Trump or sensible, is likely going to be significantly present. Especially because the significant Iranian and Russian presence in Syria means that the likelihood of harm that comes onto American soldiers will probably come from Iranian or Russian-backed sources, meaning that hawks in Congress, whether the Democrats or Republicans, have a significant incentive to push presidents to retaliate. See, for instance, what happens when American soldiers die, for instance, in Iraq. There's always an incentive not to pull out at the point at which you're ready to have a station there, and you're always perceived as being attacked by an enemy. Thirdly, note that worsening conditions often create political pressure upon Congress, upon the military to act. That is to say, you say, the limited number of soldiers we have there isn't working, we should probably put in more. This is exactly the sort of escalation of mission creep that we saw in Vietnam, for instance, that led to a 20-year civil war within the country that didn't need to happen. What we think is the ideal case for our side is exactly what happened in the Lebanese Civil War, for instance. In 1983, there was a massive terrorist bomb at the American military base. Ronald Reagan recognized that, hey, the Civil War's already been going on for 8 more years. Let's put the American soldiers there unnecessarily, and pulled out. The same result at the end of the conflict happened. Less died, less people died. Closing.
The counterfactual you likely defend is a tyrannical dictatorship which is happy to massacre millions of its people. Can you explain the comparative?
Second part of this extension, Assad and the post-conflict settlements. Note that Assad often, especially in the areas, so the areas you ought to care about that are most directly impacted by this policy are the Kurds, because that's where the American civil presence is strongest. Why exactly does Assad have an incentive to integrate the Kurds into the post-conflict Syrian political structure? First, note the political victory that he gives his regime ideological legitimacy when he says that the Kurds, which were previously backed by America, now supports me. Secondly, territorial integrity, because note the comparative once America pulls out is either Turkey invades a part of Kurdistan or Syria maintains territorial integrity. Given Assad would like to maintain control of, I don't know, borders within his own country, he has an incentive to make a deal with the Kurds. Thirdly, note Kurds have created a self-sufficient governing structure, which means that it's much easier for Assad to co-opt that rather than to create his own, especially if locals are hostile. And I think the way you know this is because once Trump announced he was pulling out, Syrian Kurds were reported to be in negotiations with the Assad regime. So, this is what's most likely to happen. Finally, unnecessary violence. We don't think Assad is likely going to just massacre people unnecessarily. Here's why. Assad's record has shown that in the event that he doesn't need to militarily defeat the rebels, he's willing to negotiate them. This is why, for instance, towards the end of the siege of Aleppo, he was willing to let rebel fighters leave in exchange for giving up their weapons and pledging allegiance to the regime. This is probably the most important thing in this round, because the likely end of the conflict in Syria is in Assad's interest as well, because there's no possibility of a resurgent rebel front. So he has an incentive, even if it's authoritarian, to keep the country relatively stable. Contrast this with a country that's completely unstable and going in flames.
I thank Prime Minister and I invite Leader of Opposition.
The problem with open government is they tell us, we have Assad, we'll probably all agree that Assad is shit, and then they provide us absolutely no comparative. US is powerless, we can't do anything, let's just let it be. On opening opposition, we're actually going to give a comparative. All of Rebuttal is going to integrate. We're going to show where more escalation happens on their side. But before that, let's just clear up the example of Lebanon and show why that's not analogous at all. Note in 1943, there was a national pact in Lebanon between all religious groups, including the Sunni and Shia Muslims and Maronite Christians. This meant in Lebanon, after the end of the Civil War, when the rebels were defeated, what you were restoring was a constitutional state that guaranteed rights to all groups within the country and was very democratic. What you're restoring in Syria is an authoritarian government which has a record of killing its own citizens with chemical weapons. Completely unanalogous. Now we're going to resolve that idea. We are going to claim, on opening opposition, that the United States can act as a coercive counter to Assad. Given the case that OG provides in its factually true that Assad has won and has the strongest military forces on the ground except the United States comparative to anyone else, he is most likely to act retaliatory towards a number of groups in his country. Before I move on, what these groups are, yes?
Is your advocacy of American military presence the same as it is in the status quo, or are you advocating sending in more soldiers?
We said if it is necessary, we probably send in more soldiers, but I'm going to explain through my case why that is not going to be necessary, because the presence of the USA is a deterrent in and of itself. Okay, back to my case. Assad may have been given minor concessions to certain groups, but that is not true of most authoritarian dictators in situations where it's politically feasible for them. The track record of all of them shows that when they have an asymmetry of power, which they do, they are likely to act in a retaliatory fashion if there is no outside power to check them, because there's also no inside power to check them. Note Saddam Hussein also sometimes gave minor concessions, but he also slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Kurds when he had the capability to do so once there was no power engaged on the ground. There are numerous groups which Assad is likely to act retaliatory towards. The Kurds themselves, which are trying to create a country out of a part of Syrian territory. We do not believe Assad is going to co-opt that and say within his nationalist rhetoric that gives him legitimacy, oh yeah, I give the Kurds their territory, peace. Secondly, the city population that revolted against him. Thirdly, the Turkey in general, because note that Assad is from an Alawite dynasty. The Alawites are a significant majority in Syria. This means they have an incentive to propagate that religious violence. Fourthly, people coming back to Syria after having fled the conflict. This is bad, first of all, because more people die, but second of all, because escalation happens on the side of opening government. When Assad is unchecked, he's very likely to create conflict with a number of groups. First of all, with the Kurds. This simply means a huge conflict destabilizes the country and creates more deaths. Know that Kurds are likely to retaliate. Know that the Kurds in Syria are probably going to get help from Iraqi Kurdistan, which is fairly autonomous, has huge amounts of oil, and can send that aid. Know they're very likely to get help from the PKK, which is an armed faction which has very much power. This essentially means that we're going to have another conflict that the strong Syrian army and the strong Kurds are going to be involved in. This also means Turkey has an incentive to join that conflict and to move in, because Turkey also has an incentive to prevent the Kurds from gaining their own autonomous regions in countries around Turkey, because it gives them more leverage to push for an autonomous Kurdistan, which would include regions of Turkey. The reason why that's a problem is twofold. First of all, because Kurdistan is a beacon of stability in the region. The Kurds are relatively ethnically homogeneous, and they have a unified political goal, which is essentially autonomy. They were one of the most stable regions during the conflict against ISIS. Therefore, because they wanted to rely on foreign aid from USA, from Russia, from China in creating an autonomous Kurdistan, they're very useful and very helpful in the fight against any terrorist group, because they're very likely to lend unified aid and to give us like a stable region. This disappears when you actually have an invasion of Kurdistan. Also, Kurds have leverage over countries in the region such as Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Because if the United States acts as broker and says, we're going to support an autonomous Kurdish state if you keep acting like a fucking dictator and massacring your own people, this is an incentive for a dictator to make concessions. Because neither of them wants to lose parts of their territory which are currently occupied by Kurds. This is removed on their side. Note also, there's a high likelihood of a Sunni-Shia conflict, right? Because tensions are already high. We have a Shia dynasty ruling a Sunni-majority country. Note also, a huge number of paramilitaries are very likely to spill in from Iraq into Syria. The Iraq war started by Shia paramilitaries being financed in order to destabilize the Sunni regime. A number of these still exist. They are very likely to lend their aid to different factions in that conflict. Note also, other countries, such as Saudi Arabia on one side and Iran on the other, are going to have a vested interest in one side winning that conflict, as OG themselves can see. This simply means more money and more arms being funneled into organizations like Hamas on one side and Hezbollah on the other side, because they are the proxies through which these countries are going to act, because they cannot intervene directly, mostly because of sanctions. This means terrorist factions in other countries also become stronger. Also, on a general level, there's probably going to be a continuation of a civil war. Now, why do we believe the United States acts as a stopper? First of all, because of the military presence in and of itself. The USA currently occupies the northwestern part of Syria, where the majority of the Kurds are located. Assad is unlikely to launch an all-out assault on a part of the world occupied by the Americans. Nobody wants a Vietnam War. Vietnam won the war, but it lasted 20 years. Thousands of people died. Same goes for Afghanistan, same goes for Iraq. Probably not something you want in your own country, already destabilized because you just out of a war. Also, you probably don't want the international community on your heels after you kill an American soldier. Russia cannot keep supporting you so ostensibly as it has, nor can Iran under the threat of sanctions after you directly kill a soldier of the American army by your own soldiers. This presence directly stops Assad from interfering with them. Before closing.
Okay, so what you're talking about here is the fact that essentially you're going to have a Kurdish state that tries to breach independence. Given that every single country that is on the border of the Kurds doesn't support Kurdistan, is it likely that in any counterfactual they're going to form their own state?
We never claimed in our case that the Kurds are going to get a state. What we claimed in our case is if Kurdistan gets invaded, more people die, you get a long conflict, and you lose the USA as a broker which can use Kurdistan to force concessions from other countries, because the USA is comparatively more powerful than any of the countries there that do not support Kurds. I probably should have listened to what I was saying. But secondly, they asked me in a POI, do we support more soldiers? More soldiers are probably not going to be necessary, because the USA has been acting more and more retaliatory towards Syria in the past years. From Obama, who did not send ground troops, to Trump, who is like officially sending rockets there. This means that Syria is aware of two things. One, if Trump wants to continue engagement in Syria, he needs to delegitimize Syria as being an axis of evil. In order to do that, he needs, as OGs say themselves in a minute of their own analysis, he needs to keep being engaged in Syria and send even more troops down there. That's disincentive for the regime. They also know that Trump is currently criticizing NATO in a very strong fashion, and that NATO has an incentive to join the conflict to prove they're actually contributing something so that Trump does not withdraw the United States from NATO. This, with coupled with threat of economic sanctions, and we all know what happened to Iran, is something that heavily disincentivizes the Assad regime from acting in an escalatory way. This means that we win on OG's measuring. This is why we're looking at opposition.
I thank Leader of Opposition, and I invite Deputy Prime Minister.
It's easy for opposition to come up here and say that Assad is a bad leader and therefore he shouldn't be in power, but they're completely ignoring their burdens in this debate. Today, I'm going to do a few points of rebuttal before talking about exactly what those burdens are that opposition has to prove to you, besides just saying that they don't like Assad, then talking about some weighing against the absolute best case scenario for opposition, and then talking just writ large about Assad. So, a couple points of rebuttal. First thing they say is, look, terrorist factions like Hamas and Hezbollah will increase at the point where US troops are out. We say, number one, they exist in Syria right now because Iran needs to fight the US, but doesn't want to send ground troops. So we think proxies actually increase a lot more on their side. So if you're talking about escalating the conflict, we think sending in a lot more soldiers is a surefire way to do that. But second of all, this also applies to factions like ISIS, because we say that people are dying right now because of the fact that the US has airstrikes against ISIS. We say that at the moment where you take the US out of the equation, we think that Assad very naturally forms an opposition to ISIS, and you get less terrorists, not more. But second of all, they say that Assad won't attack the Kurds because of US troops if we increase escalation. Number one, we think that US troops in the status quo are very small, and opposition has to commit to a massive escalation of the conflict in order to get any of their efficacy. But two, we say that Assad wants territorial integrity, so he most likely won't attack the Kurds because it's not in his interest as a leader to continue the war. Thirdly, they want to talk about an independent Kurdistan. We say that an autonomous Kurdistan won't happen. No country in the region will let them. They say that US leverage will help Assad make concessions to the Kurds. We say in the status quo, the Kurds are fighting, and this simply isn't happening. We don't see where this massive power that opposition says there are actually comes from when they're dealing with the status quo where we're losing the war. Thirdly, they say that Assad will massively slaughter people. This will lead a little bit into what I talk about later about Assad. But we say that number one, there is no incentive for Assad to do so since he's essentially already won the war. Assad's record indicates that he has not launched genocide despite already controlling 2/3 of the country, right? But second of all, we say on the Kurds, Assad wants the image of a multi-ethnic regime because he is a minority leader, so he's unlikely to try to slaughter everyone else in his country. That only creates more conflict. Let's talk about the opposition burdens in this debate. Opposition in this debate has to prove that there is either A, enough existing American support to defeat Assad, which we think is very difficult given the current trends of the war and what we see happening, or B, they have to commit to a ginormous escalation, which is very hard to predict, which means more civilians die, which means occupation that fuels terrorism and proxy wars, which are all net bad things. They also have to see what happens if they do actually get rid of Assad, because recognize it's not good enough to say that we have a bad leader status quo and we need him to go away. You have to see who that leader will be replaced with and why they will inevitably be better. What Jimbo and I bring you is that leader is most likely not going to be better because of the flight of democratic Syrians from Syria throughout the war, and also because of the giant power vacuum you create when you get rid of the only leader that they've known. Let's talk briefly about Assad. Recognize that Assad's violence is provoked by uncertainty in his regime. He has shown that he is willing to be diplomatic when he is not threatened. So threatening him by massively increasing the amount of American troops that are there is not likely to decrease violence, simply increase it. People protect themselves when they are threatened. The incentives of a leader are usually not to make your regime more unstable if you don't have to. We say things like killing your populace, things like really bad media or an international presence on the international stage, things like destroying your own infrastructure, things like being a minority leader and wanting the appearance of a multi-ethnic state. These are all things that are very, very bad for Assad at the point where he doesn't have to take these actions. The reason he won't have to take these actions is because American troops are pulling out of his country and he feels more secure. We also say, what is the comparative on top? Who are they going to put in his place and why will they be better? They haven't given this to them and they can't win this debate without it. But let's weigh against Hobbes' best case. Because in their best case, they do eventually oust Assad, and we're going to say why that is bad. One, we say recognize, because of the context that Jimbo gives, that this comes at a tremendous cost. It comes at the cost of increased proxy wars, which means you have more people dying on the ground. Recognize that airstrikes aren't just aimed at soldiers many of the times, they actually attack civilians, and that's really bad. You're looking at destruction of infrastructure within Syria, meaning people can't go back to their jobs and their lives. You have to rebuild rebuild an entire country further from what it's already damaged has already been done. You're looking at a loss of life, massive refugee conflicts which don't make people like Syria very much, and which create tremendous harm for the people who literally have to flee their country. All of these things prevent long-term stability for Syrians and the state of Syria. Increased anti-American also as well as increased anti-American sentiment and diplomatic ability. All of these things mean that in the weighing mechanism, if we want to preserve the future of Syria, if we want people to be actually able to live in the state, if we want to minimize the loss of life, all of things that across this debate people are going to say are good, you actually need to shorten the conflict. Insofar as this is the goal, we need to limit the damage to the extent that we can. That's what we do on our side of the house. But secondly, recognize that the regime that follows Assad isn't likely to be much better, and you're not likely to get the long-term stability that both sides in this debate would probably want. We see that years of conflict have basically demolished the democratic acquisition that is currently in Syria. So even in the case that they oust Assad, it's unlikely that they're going to get a perfect state that they want. It's more likely that they're going to create a power vacuum that leads to unstable regimes, and those actors we're not sure will be much better than Assad. But on top of that, even if those actors are as good as Assad, they then have to take up the account of rebuilding an entire country. We don't see a world in which opposition can actually claim that they get a better leader in there. Does that happen anything? No. Okay. I'll take my pass.
Note that the civil war started before outside involvement, when Assad was not threatened by indiscriminate attacks against his people. You did not get to paint him as a diplomatic leader.
You cannot say that the state of Syria at the start of the civil war is the same as the state of Syria today. The fact that we've been through this conflict, the fact that Assad has already shown his dominance, the fact that all of the other groups in Syria are basically seeing that there is no way they're going to win the war, means that times have changed, means that it is unlikely that Assad is going to feel as threatened, and is more likely that the civil war will not continue at the point where you don't purposefully escalate it as opposition is advocating for. But, fourthly, simple weighing on certainty versus uncertainty. Jimbo has proven that given the current trends in the conflict, combined with what happens when America eventually de-escalates, that we think on our side we have relative certainty about our ability to lessen the damage that's happening in Syria, our ability to shorten the conflict, our ability to save lives, save infrastructure, make sure that people can go back to them as soon as possible. On opposition, there are many steps that have to happen in order for them to prove any degree of efficacy in the types of futures that they want. They have to predict the actions of multiple terrorist groups, of Russia, of Syria, of what the United States is going to do in its political future. There are a bunch of boxes that have to be ticked off in order for them to get any of the impacts that they want to claim in this debate. So, on weighing, we think that a known action that has very small links to get to an end result that most people in this debate would agree with is better than the present, that limits the damage, that limits the conflict, is far preferable to an unknown action on their side, where you don't know what will happen in the future, where the most likely scenario is an escalation of a conflict that is already really, really bad. At the end of the day, opposition has several burdens to prove to you, and you cannot let them get out of this debate without claiming that those are good. Opposition cannot simply come up here and say that Assad is bad, therefore we win. They have to prove that someone who replaces him is better, and that the process of that replacement isn't going to be one that is far worse than the status quo. Thank you.
Please.
Right, I thank Deputy Prime Minister, and I invite Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Šta ovo što ste napisano u zadnjem papiru?
Ako možeš uvedi, ako
Ne
ne
mogu
mogu.
baš počitati.
Ovo pusti. Nije.
A? There's a relative stalemate of conflict in Syria in the status quo. The war is not what it used to be a couple of years ago. All of the analysis that open governments brings into this debate about the power vacuum being an incentive for things to change is literally what will lead this conflict to become far worse once a huge power pulls out of this area and actually leaves this place for grabs by other people, mostly Assad, in this debate. That is when it becomes strategically more likely that Assad will attack because he is faced with less casualties. Comparatively, this is a huge incentive to him. Because the war has been waged for a couple of years, a lot of his people have been killed, and people want stability and prosperity. One thing that we don't have to defend in this debate, or that we do not think we can impact or mechanize this debate, is that Assad will be gone. There was no single line of argumentation on our side of the house. we know what the comparatives are in international debates. They are really narrow. We do not want to claim that Assad will be gone. We say we have less incentive for him to act in a bad way. We say he has less ability to do so. But why is Assad not suddenly a big Democrat like the opening government was portraying? Because he has just won a huge war, mostly and crucially on the support of Russia and China, as opening government claims in this debate. That means that to his own people, he is now a puppet of Russia and Iran because they supported him hugely. Which means that he needs to run a hard-line government in order to show his people that he is still in control and that he is independent. So all of the things that they say that he's now going to be really liberal are not true, but he has an incentive to actually show to his people that he is still a powerful leader and that they cannot mess with him. No, thank you. On this idea that we claim that independence is going to happen to Kurdistan, we say we never actually implemented this as our impact. We say that it's more likely that the areas of Kurdistan are going to be safe, stable, and prosper, and safe from aggression. That is not the same as gaining independence in a peace process, which is still unlikely to happen in Syria for a long time. But still, Assad and the deterrence that he has in terms of like going into these areas, because there's a U.S. forces literally like on the border with this area, is a deterrence from him attacking. It's a positive way towards independence. Secondly, Turkey, which is also in this debate, is a U.S. ally. It's a bigger determinant for Turkey even to enter Kurdistan. Turkey even has a more incentive to actually like clash and back on the independence of Kurdistan because they have a Kurdish minority inside of their country, which means that any sort of like independence movement in Kurdistan is worse on their side of the house, or the stability or the incentives for Turkey to intervene are worse. So, no thank you. On this idea that Assad will be gone, this is not 2011, 2012, or 2013. The clash in this debate is whether Assad holds less territory, whether he has less control over the territory he holds, and whether he has less attacks on people and less vicious attacks. At the point in this debate where we show that he has less control over Kurdistan, that is why we win on the metric that he's still a dictator, which he has been throughout this war and before. So, let's talk about some of the ideas that come from opening government, and then I'm going to extend into why this is a signaling effect on other US partners and why this is bad. First, the idea that US soldiers are under harm and that there's political pressure to retaliate, this is second Vietnam, is factually not true. Like, you can count on one hand the number of people that have died in Syria in terms of US soldiers. These are mostly special ops troops. These are mostly political advisors. These are people who are trained to be in these sort of situations. These are people you don't get political pressure to like fight for. It's 2,000 of them already, like in the status quo, because you don't even know they're there. It's not a mass scale attack. No thank you. Secondly, they say the deal with the Kurds is comparative, like to the Kurds self. So they say that there's unlikely to be a deal with the Kurds, but they say that Kurds have a sufficient self-government in the status quo. We say that's a huge tension on their side of the house. Because once you have gained that self-actualization and self-government through the war, which you have fought most clearly in the conflict of Syria, because Kurds have most clearly defeated ISIS on their territory, they have most clearly held their territory across the Euphrates River, we say that expectations do not support this, because they expect what they have been promised by the United States in terms of as a support for the independence. But let's talk about why this is also bad for the rest of the world, not just for Syria, because foreign policy tends to overspill to other areas of the world because it's connected in various ways. So the first idea is that Kurdistan was promised independence, or at least US support for independence, for the cooperation against ISIL, for the stability that it provided in the war, and for the help against defeating ISIS in terms of providing bases to US soldiers and stuff like that. At the moment when you actually remove that by pulling out your troops, by leaving Kurdistan on its own, you are perceived as someone who does not fulfill its promises by other allies. Why is this important? Because currently there's a narrative in countries in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and in Eastern Europe, that US is likely to become not as a reliant of an ally as it used to be. Why is this problematic? Because the internal politics in these countries is either we can stick with the United States, which means we don't have to enter arms races with Russia, with China, or our neighboring threats. Or we need to have a strong army of ourselves. We need to radicalize the conflict because we won't be defended by this nation, or at least we won't have support in terms of international relations and military intervention. Why is this comparative towards, the United States already wants NATO, spend more and stuff like that? Because this is literally a sovereignty claim. All of these countries are threatened by their neighbors like China and Russia because their sovereignty is under stake. We're not claiming independent Kurdistan is going to happen. We are claiming that US withdrawing support towards independent Kurdistan. I will take closing if they have something.
Not right now, sorry.
Opening.
The only way you guarantee Kurdish stability and American allies being assured on your side is indefinite American presence in Syria, which massively increases the chance of escalation. Given Assad's incentive to integrate the Kurds into post-Kurdish Syrian conflict, why is your infinite comparison better than our guaranteed peace?
We say that US presence in Syria actually decreases escalation. We have given you a number of mechanisms of this. Why, if the United States actually withdraws from Syria, there's more opportunity for other peoples to escalate the conflict in their favor. Not only that, but there has been literally no escalation on that part of the battlefield throughout this war, which means that this war is strategically so allowed that the eastern part of the battlefield, in terms of like the Kurds and stuff like that, has been stable with regards to other than things fighting Islamists and stuff like that. So, back to my point. This is comparative because we show that in the internal mechanisms of countries and their internal politics, if the United States does that, there's going to be more radicalization on other parts of the world because people will perceive that their only way out of this stalemate they have, for example, with China, if you are Taiwan, or if you are Japan, is either A, to more radicalize, to invest more in the military, to enter the arms race, or B, to cave into the Chinese demands they have on their sovereignty and stuff like that. We think that's bad for small nations who look at the United States about this. It's not a matter only about where support is actually going to come. It's a matter of perception and how you perceive the support that has been promised in terms of international relations and in terms of strategic relations. Very proud to oppose.
What we're going to do at closing opposition is we're going to take the burden that OG threw down to opening opposition. And we're going to explain to you why a Syria ruled by Assad is actually, without American presence, is actually the very worst case scenario. We're going to explain to you why the more important comparison in this debate is Afghanistan and post-2011 Iraq. And we're going to explain to you why that's the worst possible case scenario. So that even if the not perfect situation that Offbench brings you isn't true, we're going to give you the imperative for why absolutely on a principled and practical sense we cannot endorse this policy. Before I get to that, some brief responses to closing government. That side of the House says that if we overextend and remain in Syria and we don't pull out, there will be significant backlash, both from the population of the US and from other countries. 5 responses. The first is to say that the small number of troops that exist in Syria and continue to exist in Syria makes this backlash deeply unlikely when we compare it to the fact that the US has over 250,000 troops in the rest of the world and mostly in the Middle East, meaning that this is a small drop in the ocean compared to their harm. So it is unlikely their harms accrue. No, thank you from just this. 2, that perception becomes significantly worse when Syria goes to hell, as our extension is going to explain why will happen, which means that those harms accrue even more on their side. 3, other countries are even less likely to count on the US in this situation because they're going to see that the US turned their back on the Kurds, turned their back on the rebels that they made guarantees to. As a result, US credibility is even lessened by that. 4thly, going into other countries, like intervening in Malaysia, also accrues all of the harms that side wants to hang their hat on of overextending. So if that is their concern, their policy again accrues their own harms. We think that that's a self-perpetuating problem. But 5th, we think that all of their problems of nations like Russia seeing the US as weak are actually exacerbated by pulling out and allowing Russia regional hegemony in the Middle East. We think that nothing that we get from CG is particularly new from what we got from opening government, and the new contributions they do give about jingoistic hawks in the US aren't fixed under their side. So, in substandard, what am I going to bring you? Firstly, why we actually significantly re-empower rebel groups and groups like ISIS. Because what was missing from the opening half of this debate was in this wash of assumption that Assad was going to win, and this claim by OG that because the rebels don't have a single population center, the war is over, is an understanding of what guerrilla warfare and terrorist warfare in the Middle East looks like. Because the reality is that for most of its existence, the Taliban did not control any significant population centers in Afghanistan. For the majority of existence, groups like the Mujahideen, before all the establishment of modern Afghanistan, did not control population centers and were able to successfully prosecute deeply destructive and overwhelmingly crushing wars upon the regime and the governments of those nations. Why is that likely to happen in Syria? 1, for Assad to stay in power, he needs to enforce that power and crack down. Remember, panel, that Assad has a religious regime and a regime that relies on the support of other religious powers surrounding his nation. That means that he is religiously obligated to crack down not only on the Kurds, but also on the religious groups in this country who are continuing to support, no thank you, rebel groups. And the second claim that OG makes is that no, Assad will never actually be evil unless he's threatened. The problem and the thing we bring you at CO is that he will continue to be threatened because there are still 50,000 rebel fighters in Syria. They're not going to vanish into thin air because the US leaves the country. They're going to hide away in bolt holes, in mountains, in regions where they can continue to attack through guerrilla warfare. They attack at night, they will destroy city centers, they will resort to bombing raids, and those sorts of tactics as we've seen the Taliban use in Afghanistan. This will mean the regime continuously feels under threat and will do all of the horrible things that OO was not able to show you they would, but we give you the mechanism for proving why. The third thing is that the reason that these groups will continue to fight and will not stop is the very reasons OG gives us, in that they are deeply religious, and many of them are quite fanatical. So it is unclear to me why they will vanish and disappear into the distance at the point where the US simply gives up on them. The final thing we would note here is that these groups, on top of being incredibly fanatical, also have a very, very large number of US guns and a lot of US training that we've spent the past few years giving them, which they are likely to continue to use to perpetuate this conflict. It is unclear to me, in that context, in the ability of groups in the Middle East and the long-established norm in the Middle East of those guerrilla wars being incredibly successful at attacking and destabilizing regimes, why Syria is not going to spend the next decade being a desolate wasteland of war. So, what then is the impact that we bring you then? 1. Assad is likely to crack down even more significantly and continue religious persecution. He's likely to result then in a bloody conflict and a war. And this is where, again, we bring you analysis as to what the regional actors do, because we perpetually see conflicts in the Middle East becoming proxy wars between Sunni and Shia sects. So groups like Iran continue to fund wars such as the war in Yemen in order to perpetuate interreligious conflicts. That's likely to continue to be perpetuated here. But also, the other thing we would note is that to the extent that Islamic State has been relatively defeated, there are still 5,000 Islamic State troops controlling a very large area of not populated territory, but geographical area in the east of the country. We should note that the rise of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq occurred over a period of about 2 months, where they accrued tens of thousands of fighters in a tiny period of time. The ability of terrorist organizations to amass forces and overrun, and I'll take opening in a moment, government groups in a very short amount of time cannot be understated. And all of the reasons I've given you in this member speech show why that is much more likely to happen under their side. Before I get to why that doesn't happen under our counterfactual, opening.
Even in your best case, and we just saw Lodge's indiscriminate massacres, in the absence of explaining how he leaves or how he maintains less power, the only thing you're guaranteed is more instability, which leads to things like the rise of groups and resurgence of groups like ISIS.
I'm glad you asked. Third point in of extension, why that doesn't happen under our counterfactual. Because the reality is that when these rebel groups that, as I've pointed out at closing opposition, still exist, will continue to exist and still will perpetuate these wars, when they lose US support, they turn to worse actors. They turn to Iran, they turn to Al-Qaeda, they turn to terrorist forces like we saw Iraqis do in 2011, like we saw Islamic State do when they were just the Al-Nusra Front, and as we saw the Free Syrian Army do when the US turned their back on them. When you allow these groups to become so much more radicalized by denying them the moderating force of US support and US presence and training, is that they turn to those worse actors and are heavily radicalized by those worse actors. The existence of the US in those countries prevents the ongoing conflict and the war and the radical war and the religious conflict that I've just described. That's the mechanism by which we prevent the worst possible impact in this debate. A Syria that will never see stability, a Syria that will never see benefit. Panel, if you take anything from the closing half of this debate, understand that the worst situation we could possibly have in Syria was an ongoing and unending religious conflict. That's a contribution you should credit from CO.
I thank member of opposition. I now invite Government with
Closing opposition takes this debate panel because we explained the counterfactual that the opening half could never decide. We told you why post-Assad Syria, or even an Assad Syria that was more moderated, was the one that made people safer on the ground, was the one where people were able to pursue without rebel groups running around with US guns, continuing to become more radicalized. What did we tell you? We told you at the point at which rebels do not feel supported, at the point at which rebels no longer have the influence of the United States, they turn to worse actors. They turn to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. They turn to Iran, and they radicalize when they lose that backing. We tell you that results in acting in more radical ways, not approaching things like ceasefires, not approaching things like negotiations. CG says that they are a lost cause. You were the ones that made them the lost cause, that drove them to radicalization. You missed the structural reasons we gave you as to why they would not put down their arms. That was religious fanaticism. That was the training and the weapons that they already had, which gave them the feeling that they had a chance against disrupting the regime that had put them down for so long. Our extension was that yes, that rebel groups equipped with US weapons and US training will continue to wreak havoc, particularly with the presence of the Islamic State, and particularly when Assad cracks down in order to pursue the radical religious prosecution that they seek. What did we tell you about how we beat Assad and what was the long-term trajectory? I would know that the endgame was largely unmissed by opening opposition. We're going to explain this to you, and we did at closing opposition. We told you that the presence of the United States, as our opening says, will continue as an ongoing stalemate, and that is a very good thing. Because what we bring at closing opposition was the degree of moderation and less radicalization as a result of the United States withdrawing. That moderation meant that the sorts of deals that opening government wanted were way more likely on the outside of the house, because you had actors that were more calm, that were more stable, that were more solidified in their defense of their regions. We told you at the point at which rebel groups were more moderated, you had the capacity for long-term stability and ceasefires. That looked like Colombia, for example, rather than turning to terrorists in order to pursue their religious agendas. That was what we brought you, which still stands in this debate. What am I going to do now? No, thank you. First, I'm going to discuss closing government and finish up what was left of their extension, and finally spend the majority of my speech talking about opening government and why their conclusions do not arise. First, with regards to closing government, they say, well, because the United States are focused on healthcare at the moment and they understand what is occurring, they have lost the political will. I would say if that was true, then perhaps they would have withdrawn years ago. It is bizarre to me that right now is the point at which of time that becomes critical. But also, if that were true, then they also self-defeat that own argument about political capital to intervene anywhere else. Like if suddenly healthcare was this crazy big issue for the United States that they could not justify this war, why on earth would they be able to justify any other type of intervention literally anywhere else? But also it is deeply unclear to me what conflicts closing government believes are more important than a dictator who has chemically bombed their own citizens. Like what exactly is the bar for them at the point at which the US would intervene, and does that exist? I think their logic falls down anyway, because if President Trump is winning politically by saying that, oh, well, I am winning in Syria, and they can keep tweeting about that. If they continue to win, he can continue to tweet, and that is probably going to be more politically favorable than exiting Syria, seeing Syria go to shit as per our extension that explained to you why it would, and losing that political capital that had in the first instance. So I would say that political capital isn't a metric in this debate, but even if it were, we think closing opposition extension defeats that uniquely. Moving on to opening government, they bring you two claims in this debate. First, that we will not win, and so this intervention is unjustified. And secondly, that post-Assad Syria does not have a future, and that is the reason why we should not remain. To the first, we will not win. I don't think they have a great deal of justification for this claim, other than Assad currently has a lot of land. As we proved to you in extension, we tell you that land is not the metric by which we should assess this intervention, because of the things like terrorist and guerrilla warfare and things like radicalization that can occur very quickly at the point at which we have the internet and guns and things like that. I think that is not the metric by which panel you should assess whether or not we are fighting that war, but also particularly in the scope of ISIS, no thank you, we think that that's not particularly true. The next thing that they say is that, well, we're definitely losing this war, and we will continue to lose because Iran and Russia have direct incentives like political stability, while America's are there for philosophical reasons. Firstly, I would say that the incentives of America are still aligned with things like supporting Israel and destabilizing Russia, which has been proven to interfere with their elections. I would say all of those concrete incentives still exist under that side of the house, and that we should probably remain there for those reasons alone, even if it came down to a proxy fight. And perhaps those are legitimate interests of the US. But also, I think there is a principled justification that the United States can sell to its citizens here as well. The US turned their backs in 2013 under Obama to the Syrians, and they allowed those citizens to die. Those conflicts continued to escalate, and barely
and they barely assisted the refugees that came thereafter. I think at the point at which the US re-engages in that conflict and says to those Syrians on the ground and says to the rebel groups that they are there for change, they are there to facilitate that improvement, I think that is the point at which they give that obligation to themselves. I'll take you in a second. I think their incentive should align with that as well. Yeah.
The prominent rebel groups that exist in Syria are already radicalized due to reasons in my speech about geographic, ethnic, and religious divisions. This was radicalized despite American assistance and presence that went back to 2013. The only thing that you guarantee, despite a marginal decrease in radicalization in your best case, is indefinite conflict.
Thank you. Panel, that was a really important concession from opening government, that these rebel groups are currently radicalized and will continue to become more radicalized at the point at which they concede that there was a moderate de-radicalization of rebel groups under our side of the house. We tell you that is the precise problem at closing opposition, is that rebel groups, at the point at which they become more radicalized, continue to destabilize that government, which leads to worse outcomes for citizens on the ground and the future of Syria altogether. If we have any marginal de-radicalization, that is a benefit in this debate, but also if they prove that they are currently radical rebel groups, at the point at which the US withdraws, why would they become less radical? That is a hole in the government bench, if ever I saw one. So at the end of that piece of rebuttal, what did I tell you? I think opening government hang their hat on the fact that there was, we are losing, Assad has already won and that we need to withdraw. I've proven to you why that doesn't exist. The second thing that they bring is that post-Assad Syria doesn't have a future and so we should not bother. As I said before, when it comes to, post-Assad Syria absolutely has a future when it comes to moderating of rebel groups that will lead to things like ceasefires, as we have seen in Colombia. But also, I think we proved that the future was worse under government bench and things like Mission Creek would not exist. The reason why we got over opening opposition in this debate panel was for three reasons. Firstly, it was our analysis that proved the results of opening government's policy hurt Syria for a longer time and for a certain time. The end game was always missing from the opening half. Closing opposition were the team that brought it. Second, it was our analysis which provided the best route for ceasefires and stability in Syria. We told you at the point at which rebel groups came to the table, that was the only path for peace, the only path for a stable future. But finally, it was our analysis which showed that Assad would be the most brutal, which opening opposition could never prove at the point at which the US was not there. For all of those reasons, we must not withdraw. Proud to oppose.